Hey, so I wanted to try something new today and share some ideas with a recorded video instead of an essay. So, what I'm going to be talking about today is what a brand is, and I'm going to be giving three different understandings of what that looks like. Um, the first idea is brand as consensus system, which you may be a little bit familiar with if you read my Headless Brands essay with Laura Lottie and Sam Hart. And the second idea is brand as conflict. And the third idea is brand as interface. I think it's important to understand what a brand is and what it is not. If you want to understand culture today, the brand is kind of a cultural formation that is one of the most important for our time, the same way that religions or guilds or other organizations were important to different times. So let's jump into it. I'm using this application called Vidrio to record myself while I'm recording the screen. So the first thing that might be worth asking is, what is a brand? I think a lot of people view a brand as an identity system, or maybe they view it as like the reputation of a company, and that's a slightly better step. But what's most important is that people often view the brand as like a single unit, a single entity, maybe something that looks like this. And what we're going to talk about is why it looks like this instead. A brand is not just one thing. A brand is a set of concepts. Now maybe that's intuitive for some of you, maybe it's less intuitive for some, but a brand can be considered the sum of every concept, every expectation, every impression, every reputation, every association that people have with a given entity. An entity that could be a product or it could be a company. It could be a person or an organization. But the brand is all of those things. So from the very first step, we can see that people are things that have brands as well, or objects like coffee. Coffee is something that has like a set of concepts, expectations, impressions, and reputations around it. It's a given entity, but you could consider coffee to be a brand. We're going to be talking mostly about companies and products. A brand is this way because it lives in the mind of stakeholders. Everybody who has an idea of what the thing is contributing to the brand. And you can see that the people who are ostensibly in charge of making the brand, the employees of a company or people who worked on a product, those, the proportion of that set of stakeholders in comparison to the full set of stakeholders, which includes customers of a product, but also anybody who has an interaction with it, people who post about it on Twitter, people who write about it, who make tutorials or blog about it, is much smaller. So what is the brand? How do people actually come to access what the brand is? Well, first of all, there are touch points. Touch points is kind of the language that we normally use in branding and marketing to talk about different points where people access the brand and start to form a concept of what that is. And the group of people who are nominally in charge of making the brand, the employees or people who work on it, are involved in the production of touch points. So that includes a product itself. It includes the website where people access it, maybe content that is published or documentation, and it includes other things like that, companies or projects, social media presence. But an important thing to understand is that these touch points live in inside a much larger universe of touch points. Though these three dots here in the middle represent these official touch points that we were just discussing, but there's a much larger set of touch points here that correspond directly to the much larger set of people who are involved in making that brand alive. So these could be blog posts, shit posts on Twitter, IRL conversations that people have, Wikipedia about the company page. That may not be editable by the company itself. Posts people make, tutorials, reviews on review sites, individual reviews, and like official reviews. These are all things that people can come into contact with and form an understanding of what the reputation of that company or product is. So one thing to take away from this is that the resources that a company produces are, again, much smaller in proportion to the full set of artifacts that a brand is associated with. Another thing that this should show us is that a brand is something that is always in production. We can really only take snapshots of what the brand is at any given time. Today, Google's brand is not as great as it was 15 years ago. They haven't lived up to that tagline, "Don't be evil." And we can also see that branding is not really distinct from marketing activities. Like the production of these artifacts by a company is usually considered marketing, but we can see that it's also related to, it is in fact like this branding process. And it might be helpful to stop thinking of brand as a verb, but more as this process that happens. Branding would be more accurate than just the idea of a brand in general. It also, from this perspective, we can also see how many different brands can exist at the same time. If we're in this world where maybe this dot represents a review site, an aggregate of many different reviews of a product, and somebody happens on that one site and reads things, they'll form a different impression than what they would get from reading the official documentation, which might have like a price comparison to different products and like a competitive feature list. So people can form very different concepts, reputations, and impressions of what a brand is. Now, the network, living in a networked media environment, produces a very different type of dynamic with brands than one we might have had before. And that's because the network drives consensus. It tends to amplify a certain set of concepts or reputations that are there. One way you can think about this is algorithms, like PageRank or YouTube's recommendation algorithm. If there's a piece of content that is has like a little bit of traction early on, it tends to get prioritized by the algorithm, which will drive more and more traffic to that content. Or if you jump from piece of content A to piece of content B, and a lot of people do that, then the network will start recommending content B after content A in the recommendations list on YouTube. Or the way that Google PageRank will highly rank sites that have lots of linkbacks to them already. And this is how consensus around a given brand concept is amplified by the network. Something that already has momentum, when put into this network environment, it tends to increase in proportion to other concepts or voices around what a brand can be. But as we've seen, there are different brands as well. So the network also creates dissensus. There might be 2 or 3 different points that have been aggregated and amplified by PageRank or on a review site voted highly recommended review. So there are many different brands really, or associations that people have with a given entity that overlap, and they may align in some ways and they may not align in other ways. So to just summarize what we have so far, a brand can be considered a consensus system because a brand, if nobody agreed on what a brand was, then it wouldn't be coherent. If there were only 3 people who knew about the company Uber, which we're going to be using as an example, and they all had totally different ideas of what Uber was. One person thought it was Blue Apron's product. One person thought it was a ride-sharing app, and the other one thought it was the prefix to Mensch, and it's just Nietzsche's Übermensch. Then there would be no shared agreement on what that thing is. There would just be 3 different understandings. But when there's overlap, then you have a brand. Then you have agreement and consensus. But in this fully networked environment where many people are forming different impressions all the time around what is a thing, you're going to have disagreement. So as disagreement and as agreements form and are amplified and conflict with different agreements, basically you have like shifting consensus and dissensus. And I think it's really important to understand how this is qualitatively new state of affairs. Before the internet, before this networked environment, it was much easier for brands to deterministically tell customers or potential customers what to think about a product, because there weren't really ways for customers to talk to each other outside of one-to-one conversational media like phones or conversations. Whereas companies had access to economies of scale. They had like information leverage, and they could broadcast more cheaply to a high number of people. Now we have a many-to-many media environment where lots of different people are posting lots of different things. All of those things are equally highly visible because the marginal cost of access to that thing is 0. And this is why brands have become consensus systems today. I guess brands were always consensus systems in this way, but this is what gives rise to the possibility for dissensus, and creates the opportunity for conflict. And that's what we're going to be talking about next. Cool. So let's talk about brand as conflict. In part 1, just a few minutes ago, we talked about how companies go about defining their brand, and they do so by producing these touch points. People access these touch points and they start to form impressions about what that brand is about. And if there were no other unofficial touch points like those produced in tweets, blog posts, reviews, etc., all there would be is the official touch points of the company. The content that they make, and the actual product itself, their customer support. But that's not the case. There's a much larger set of touch points. Now, users have a slightly different agenda than companies, really a very different agenda. What they want to know is, would I use this product? Will it accomplish my goals? Does this company's action align with my beliefs? Customers just want to know how well a product helps them accomplish the goals that they have. And so this is why reviews and this kind of auxiliary media is very helpful for them to make a decision. Now, as we talked about before, the brand really lives in this auxiliary space. The touch points that are officially defined by the company live in the public, but the public is much greater. This whole space is a commons, and the meaning of the brand lives in the commons, in this place where people are questioning, asserting, getting angry at brands and saying what it is and what it is not. in this much greater space is where the vast majority of opinion formation happens. So again, we need to really return to the point that the brand lives and dies within this greater public space that is much larger than the set of touch points that the companies actually are involved with the production of. So because of this, we can say that every brand is really a conflict between the official touch points and intentions of the company and the reality of what users or potential customers are thinking and feeling in the wild. And I just pulled a quote from the Headless Brands essay that Sam and Laura and I wrote that I think captures this idea of conflict really well. And the quote is, "Most companies impose a hierarchical brand management model onto what has effectively become a distributed, permissionless process." This is what we were talking about before here. This is a hierarchical brand management model, but today we live in a networked society, and the drive towards like brand transparency exists because people are kind of in conflict with the brand about what it actually is. The company wants it to be one thing, and users feel it's something else. We can understand this as an example of the principal-agent problem, which is a classic kind of thought experiment or problem in economic theory and theory of the firm. The principal-agent problem supposes that you have, let's say, a company that delegates some control, some responsibility to an agent. Could be a consultant or an employee or a manager of the company, a CEO. But depending on the agreements of the contract, the agent may not really have the incentive to maximize value for the company. Instead, they might just want to maximize value for themselves. And a classic example of this would be a CEO who gets brought in to replace the founders 10 years after a company starts, for example, and they're not really given a meaningful equity package. They're just given kind of a cushy compensation of $1 million a year salary, for example. Is that CEO going to be incentivized to maximize shareholder returns or make the company as valuable as they can? Possibly not. We can think about brands as an example of this, where companies have effectively delegated responsibility to users to form what the brand is. Now, they didn't want to do this. As we've said, the companies are very reluctant to give control. They want to determine what the brand is for other people, rather than having the brand determined by users. But after the internet happened, they didn't really have any choice. So responsibility and control over brand has effectively been abrogated from companies and given to users. And this has adverse effects for both parties. For example, users have one set of expectations for what companies are or should do, and companies will defy those expectations unexpectedly. For example, the mishaps that have been happening with American Airlines or United Airlines, where they have been kicking people of color off their planes, or to take it to the religious realm, the Catholic Church has been having issues with sexual harassment in the church. This is a very ungodly thing, and people are upset. So people are losing, the customers in this respect of the users are losing their trust and faith. That's bad. And they're also exiting the church. So that's bad for the church as well. I think it's important to note that this has the conflicts that arise are problematic for both users and companies. For users, it's tempting to be on the side of users and say users are holding companies to a certain standard, but it's also bad when they have to exit and go find a product that they want more. Um, so there are a couple ways that companies have been trying to solve this principal agent problem, this conflict. And they use both proactive and reactive strategies to do that. Example of a reactive strategy would be trying to catch up to the speed at which opinion formation is happening out there in the greater network of the world where brand formation is happening. So to catch up, companies might have really culturally aware, shitposty meme Twitter accounts like the Arby's or the Wendy's account. This is an example of trying to move at the speed that of culture, so the brand can't be seen as being behind. Or commentating on current events is another example. When brands start producing critiques of brands, is an example of a brand trying to catch up to where the discourse in the culture is at. So they can't be seen as being behind or misaligned. Another example of this would be planted reviews. Companies are trying to react to the volume of information that's out there by paying Amazon Mechanical Turkers, for example, to go to their website or go to Amazon and just write reviews of products and kind of DDoS the network with positive information. But there are also proactive conflict management strategies, and those involve trying to astroturf user trust and user alignment such that users will actually proactively defend the brand from and give it leeway, cut it some slack if it fucks up, and that in order to turn a user into a brand advocate like that, a brand has to be very aligned with the user's value system, and this is how we can understand the need for values-oriented marketing that has emerged today. Why is every brand doing values-driven marketing? And that's what we're going to talk about next. But I hope this has given you an idea of how we can see the brand as like a site of conflict or the result of a conflict. So where we left off, we were talking about ways that companies try to address the conflict between user perception of what the brand is and the company's intentions for how the brand is perceived. And one way that they try to do that is by proactively bootstrapping user trust and alignment. And so how might they do that? Well, imagine that there is a user values, a value system of you that some potential customers or people have, not necessarily users yet. And these are a fairly well-defined set of values. By defined, I mean that people understand when those values are being gone against. And there may be certain language that they use to talk about those values. That's why I've kind of denoted it with a semi-permeable but salient boundary. So the way that, how do companies try to get involved with that value system? Well, one thing they do is create touch points that clearly sit inside that sphere of values. Those touch points might be photographs in which people are dressed the way that people who subscribe to these values dress. They might be using certain language or messaging in their copy, or having certain aesthetics that are associated with this set of values. They may work with influencers who are already recognized as people who subscribe to this particular value system. They might produce events, and so on. And the effect of creating enough touch points within this kind of that adhere to this set of values is that the brand starts to look like it fits within that set of values. And this is the essence of what a lifestyle brand is. It's a brand that has become irrevocably associated with a certain set of values. Now, why is this a good thing? Why is this an important thing to do for a brand? Well, first of all, we have to remember that users experience a brand before they use a product, in almost every case. It's very rare that somebody says like, hey, I need to, an example where the opposite would be the case is I go to my neighbor's house in suburbia and say, hey, I need to use your weed whacker. And they hand me a weed whacker and I start using it. It turns out to be a very good weed whacker, and I look at the brand and it's DeWalt. In most cases, these days, we're probably going to hear about a popular app or a direct-to-consumer brand or what have you before we actually buy the product itself. And part of that is because like the ad networks are so pervasive. So when we think about the funnel, users are almost always experiencing the brand before they experience the product. Now, when the brand is embedded within this lifestyle, this system of user values, we can hypothesize, at least this is what brands do hypothesize, is that the customer acquisition cost is decreased because users are much more likely to buy a brand that aligns with their values, that is creating these touch points that communicates to them, hey, I'm aligned with these values, than they are to buy a brand that is outside of the sphere of their values. So we can think of the brand this way as an interface that sits between the customer and the product. The customer always is going to experience the product through the brand, whether this is a lifestyle brand or not. The brand is an interface for experiencing the product. And it's also an interface that selects for customer segments. So here's a visualization of how the product is always experienced by means of the brand. And maybe we can run through an example of this. Let's pick Uber again. So it's 2016, and Donald Trump has just been elected, and I am a random Uber user, and let's kind of go through the phenomenology of a use session. So I need to get somewhere. I need to go from my house to a party. The trains are down and it's very rainy, and I've determined that I'll be late and wet and miserable if I don't take a car. Now I have Uber installed on my phone, and I have the opportunity to decide whether I'll use it or not. And I can imagine that if I do use the app, I don't support what Uber does. It does a lot of illegal things. It's not good to its drivers, or so I've been hearing out here in this world of touch points. I've already formed an opinion that Uber isn't supportive of its drivers. So if I use the application now, if I decide to hit the button and get a car from Uber, I might feel guilty after the fact. And in fact, I'm already feeling the potential guilt so much, and I would evaluate myself more poorly if I actually use this app. I don't want to feel guilty about myself, so I might not even do it. This is and I might try, at this point I might use Lyft instead, because I know they're giving free rides to protesters from the airport or whatever. So this is just an example of how brands, like the brand is always like the filter over which we are using the product. We are only using the product insofar as we're using it through the brand meanings that are there. And this is a point that I want to reiterate. Brands are about these associations, the meanings and associations that we have with a thing, right? So this can often lead to conflicts within the product team context, because from this perspective, it's easy to see that everybody who works on a team is involved with the production of meanings. The business decisions that are made will also determine the meanings that people have about the product. The speed of the product, the use of the product itself, that is determined by good engineering practices and scalable architecture, also determine the meanings that people come to have about the product. That may be surfaced through reviews or posts or whatnot before people even use the product, because people talk about performance. And third, PMs or whoever, feature sets, like everybody who is involved with determining what the product is going to be is also involved with the production of these meanings. And the reason that this can produce conflict on a product team is because designers are really the only ones who are given the mandate of thinking about the meanings that people have with the product. But it's everybody's responsibility to think about the associations and reputation that the product will have about it, because the product will always be used through that lens. So to wrap things up, I just want to summarize. A brand is not a visual identity, and it would really do us a big favor. It would do everybody a big favor. Users, customers, designers, marketing folks. It would do everybody a service to stop thinking about brands as the visual identity. A brand is a set of meanings, the full sum of the meanings that people have about the product. And the visual identity is just one set of artifacts that help determine those meanings. A brand is a process that is constantly in production. It's really indistinguishable from the marketing activities, the activities of its employees. Anything that can enter the public sphere will also determine the brand in an ongoing way. And all the things that happen in the public sphere that are out of control of the company also determine the brand. A brand is a consensus system. It's large-scale sets of agreement about what these meanings are. And there is conflict about what those meanings are, not only between different sets of users, but also between the company and the users themselves. And there are many different things that companies and users try to do to force, users try to force the company to conform to their meanings, and companies try to force users to conform to their meanings. And finally, a brand is an interface between the product and the user. A brand is something that's always experienced first when people are using the product, because it is indistinguishable from the meanings that they have from the product. That's what a brand is. Cool. Thanks for watching, and if you think this is fun, maybe we'll do it again sometime.